Today's video is brought to you by Card Kingdom. And right now you can get this sweet Scoop Soldier sticker when you order over on cardkingdom.com. Just mention in your order notes that you want a Scoop Soldier sticker when you check out. Hey friends, it's Tomer and welcome back to Budget Commander. This video has been 7 years in the making. Skullbriar the Walking Grave was one of the very first commanders that I tried covering on my then new Budget Commander series before my Goldfish days back when I was writing for a site called Pure MTGO. Skullbriar has always fascinated me ever since I started playing the format back with the release of Commander 2011 due to its completely unique ability of permanently storing counters placed on it as it moves to any zone other than a player's hand or library. This means that Skullbriar being removed from the battlefield doesn't undo all the hard work you put into growing it with counters, instead letting you pick up from where you left off without losing all your previous momentum. For example, if Skullbriar is killed while it has 5+1/+1 counters on it and goes back to your command zone, it will return with those 5+1/+1 counters on it once you recast it instead of being just a tiny 1/1 with haste again. Being able to safely invest in a counter strategy around your cheap aggressive commander was a very novel and exciting deck idea to the younger version of me, and I wanted to fully explore it in an article. Back when I started writing Budget Commander, I used to do a lot of my brewing process over on a site called Tapped Out, and my first Skullbriar draft from 7 years ago still exists. I'd make a rough draft, tune it with playtesting on Magic Online, then once I was happy with its performance, I'd commit to a full article exploring it. Looking back at my old list, I am quickly reminded why I scrapped my article. The deck was too weak for my publishing standards. The problem was that despite having such a unique ability, there wasn't much you could do to take advantage of Skullbriar's counter storage ability other than loading it up with +1/+1 counters with cards like Increasing Savagery, Forgotten Ancient, and Shape of the Wittigo. And while permanently storing +1/+1 counters on your commander is sweet, the end result is you've just put a lot of work into making a decently big creature with haste. That's it. Even back in 2011, that was a pretty weak payoff for all that investment. Keep in mind that Skullbriar was released in the same set that brought us old school classic commanders like Kali of the Vast, Edric Spymaster of Trest, and Carador Ghost Chieftain, commanders that eclipse Skullbriar both in power and popularity. So after some lackluster results from initial testing, I stopped working on my Skullbriar article. Poor Skullbriar was left to collect dust in the junk pile for many years, waiting for the day that its unique ability would become relevant. That day finally came many years later with the release of the partner sets Ikoria, Lair of Behemoths, and Commander 2020. These sets introduce keyword counters, counters that give a permanent their on a keyword ability, such as giving a creature a trample counter with Titanoth Rex, or indestructible counter with Daring Fiend Bonder. Now suddenly Skullbriar can permanently store many beneficial types of counters, significantly increasing its power and potential. After 7 years of keeping this brew on the shelf, it's time for me to finally complete Budget Skullbriar. Our goal with this deck is simple. We are looking to beef up Skullbriar the Walking Grave with counters, loading it up with +1/+1 counters with cards like Hydra's Growth, and getting around blockers with evasion counters like Trample from Titanoth Rex. And then we just kill our opponents with commander damage. We will prevent our opponents from stopping us with protection counters like Hexproof from Slippery Bogbonder, and even if Skullbriar dies, we'll cheaply return it to the battlefield stronger than before with cards like Call of the Death Dweller. Our Skullbriar plane is very resilient to removal, but if it does get shut down, that's not a problem. We've got backup beaters that scale out of control with +1/+1 counters like Managorger Hydra and Vulturous Zombie to get the job done, or we just reanimate the biggest beater in any graveyard and win with that instead. Now that we've got a game plan for this deck, let's talk about the key cards that make it tick. We'll do the typical breakdown of mana, card draw, interaction, and other deck fundamentals, but first let's cover the fun stuff that turns Skullbriar into a game-winning commander. Skullbriar grows into a threat primarily through +1/+1 counters. It puts a +1/+1 counter on itself each time it deals combat damage, and many of the other cards that I'll be covering later later on in this video also give Skullbriar +1/+1 counters as a side effect while fulfilling their primary role. To accelerate our game plan, however, we'll be adding a few cards whose primary purpose is to grow Skullbriar. For adding the highest number of counters with 0 setup required, nothing beats the mana efficiency of increasing Savagery. 5 +1/+1 counters for 4 mana is a great rate when cast from your hand, and then the flashback of 10 counters for 7 mana just can't be beat. Forgotten Ancient is another insane +1/+1 counter generator, generating a counter anytime any player casts a spell, quickly filling Skullbriar with counters after a single turn cycle. Predatory Hunger is another super efficient way to load up Skullbriar full of counters as your opponents cast their creatures for the low cost of 1 green mana. Veryl's the Scar Striped is another interesting one, letting you recycle all the creatures in your graveyard and turn them into +1/+1 counters. There are also a ton of cards that increase the number of +1/+1 counters you get from other sources, like Winding Constrictor, or we can double all the counters with cards like Corpsejack Menace, Invigorating Surge, and Branching Evolution. Next are the new keyword counters that give Skullbriar some much needed punch when it attacks. Titanoth Rex and Void Beckoner can be cycled to give Skullbriar permanent trample and death touch, and later on we can just reanimate them to add extra huge beaters onto the battlefield. Call of the Death Dweller brings Skullbriar back from the grave with death touch and menace, great for getting through blockers. I'm also a fan of Unexpected Fangs in this deck too, since for some reason people don't like it when we attack them with Skullbriar and end up attacking us back, so the permanent lifelink keeps us at a safe life total. But my favorite smashy card in the entire deck has to be the Ozolith. It's a weird and non-intuitive interaction with our commander, but basically Skullbriar's counters remain on it when it leaves the battlefield, but you also get to put a copy of all those counters onto the Ozolith, doubling the amount of counters on Skullbriar when it comes back later. That's an insane amount of value for a 1 mana artifact. Next, let's cover the deck's mana base. Since our commander requires a green and a black mana to be cast on turn 2, mana fixing is more important than usual for our 2-color deck. Lands that tap for either green or black are key here, or at least one of those colors, with colorless lands harming our deck's consistency and needing to be very good to be worth considering. Basic budget mana fixers like Tainted Wood work great here, but there's also a bunch of sweet lands that efficiently add a counter to Skullbriar, such as Llanowar Reborn, Oran Reef the Vastwood, and Opal Palace. We're in green, so there's no end of sweet ramp cards for our deck no matter the budget. There are some niche cards that can shine particularly bright in Skullbriar, however. Ordeal of Nylea is fantastic, growing Skullbriar and ramping us 2 lands for just 2 mana, one of my favorite cards in the deck. There's also One with Nature, a super underrated, repeatable 1 mana ramp spell. Once we attack a single time with it, it's already a half price rampant growth, which is just amazing, and any additional lands we get is just absurd value. I also love Incubation Druid here because there's a lot of ways to give it a +1/+1 counter outside of paying 5 mana to adapt it, and a 2 mana ramp creature that taps for 3 is a great rate. Ramping and beating face is good and all, but what's the point if you're not drawing cards? Thankfully, we have tons of amazing card draw options in our deck. First and foremost are green card draw spells that are keyed off our biggest creature's power and toughness, like Rishkar's Expertise, Hunter's Insight, Hunter's Prowess, and Return of the Wild Speaker. Resolving any of these spells with a decently sized Skullbriar or other big creature on the battlefield will instantly refill our hand. We also have cheap incremental card draw with Sixth Sense and the more protective Snake Umbra, slow card draw that comes with other bonuses like the First Iron Games, and of course tons of generic black card draw such as Siphon Mind. Being in Golgari colors means that we can easily deal with any threat we come across. There aren't many notable thematic options that I'd recommend, though casting Find/Finality is a decent enough board wipe that adds counters to Skullbriar in the process, and we can leverage its ever-increasing size by having it fight smaller creatures repeatedly with Ulvenwald Tracker. However, I'm totally fine with recommending just generic staples like Nature's Claim and Snuff Out, which are just as great here as they are anywhere else. Since our commander is our primary win condition, we need to take steps to ensure it isn't being easily removed. The two best options are the ones that add keyword counters. Slippery Bogbonder gives Skullbriar permanent hexproof, and Daring Fiendbonder gives it permanent indestructible. Another great option is Ring of Zathrid, which lets us regenerate Skullbriar while slowly adding +1/+1 counters to it each turn. Kaya's Ghost Form is another cheap and excellent way to make sure Skullbriar immediately returns to the battlefield the next time it's removed. While Skullbriar is cheap enough that it can be recast a couple times from the command zone if it dies, there are many times where it's just more mana efficient for us to just let it stay in the graveyard and then put it back directly into play with some graveyard recursion. For budget ways to get back Skullbriar from our graveyard, we've got Unearth as the cheapest way, and we can cycle it when we don't need it, Call of the Death Dweller, which also gives it Death Touch and Menace, and Gruesome Menagerie, which can get up to 2 other creatures along with our commander. We also have generic card draw recursion like Regrowth to get back any card from our graveyard. Golgari has a variety of sweet tutors to choose from. In this particular deck, I'm very fond of Gerard's Orders and Final Parting as ways to tutor up something useful to our hand while also putting something useful in the graveyard, which almost always is going to be Daring Fiendbonder, so we can immediately give Skullbriar indestructible. Another solid budget inclusion includes Diabolic Tutor, which is just generic good stuff. Now that we've covered all aspects of the deck, let's check out some sample deck lists. The starting list already contains most of my favorite cards for the deck. Our tutors, Gerard's Orders, and Final Parting are all-stars here, often putting Slippery Bogbonder in our hand and Daring Fiendbonder in our graveyard. We can quickly load up on +1/+1 counters with cards like Forgotten Ancient and Increasing Savagery, plus double the amount of counters with Corpsejack Menace and Hydra's Growth. The rest of our deck is loaded with interaction, card draw, ramp, and protection. Doubling the budget lets us snag another powerful counter doubler, the Ozolith. We also have better burst draw with Rishkar's Expertise, better mana with Utopia Sprawl and Shizo Death Storehouse, and another powerful +1/+1 counter threat with Mana Gorger Hydra. Doubling our budget yet again allows us to pick up some very expensive options that help with the deck's consistency. We have another powerful counter doubler with Branching Evolution, faster mana with Overgrown Tomb, more tutoring with Green Sun Zenith, better protection with Veil of Summer, and faster board wipes with Toxic Deluge. And that's it for Budget Skullbriar. I hope this one was worth the wait. Next up, I'm going to do something a bit different by exploring Chandra Tribal, but if there's any commander you'd like to see me cover in a future video, then let me know in the comment section below. So until next time, friends, see ya! Thanks for watching the video. If you liked it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up with the latest and greatest, click on the subscribe button, and don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to check out similar videos, click on the links here and here.